G'day team, it's another episode of a closer look at the book. We are going to be spending a little bit of time today talking about the Old Testament prophets. Now, that's a big chunk of the Old Testament again, going through from Isaiah through to the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi. And it's a pretty interesting group. You've got a few major prophets, these are the ones that basically have got longer books, and then what the Jews refer to as Daniel and the 12, the minor prophets. And they are a group on their own. Some of them are a single chapter. Some of them are a bit longer, and some of them have got some glorious rants in them. But they all kind of fit into one kind of group, which is the Old Testament prophets. And their prophecies we need to understand well, because there's a couple of really helpful things that make sense of the prophets for us. And the first thing is that prophecy is not about foretelling. It's not about being focused on what is going to happen necessarily. It's not about predicting the future, which is often where we come from. We get it wrong. And there is a little bit of that in the Old Testament prophets, and particularly Daniel talks about a whole lot of future events. Some of them are actually already past for us, but are future for him. But most of the time, the prophets have got an entirely different job to do. It's not foretelling, it's what's called forthtelling. It's reminding people what God has already said. So it's actually more backwards focused than it is forwards focused, if that makes sense. Because what the nation of Israel was operating on was a covenant, was this agreement that God had made with them. And the prophet's job was to call people back to the covenant. And so they would use all sorts of illustrations and pictures, and sometimes their own actions and examples. Isaiah named his children particular things to help them to understand this. Hosea married a prostitute to demonstrate to Israel what happened when what it looked like to be married to an unfaithful woman. God sort of showing the unfaithfulness of Israel through this. There was all sorts of kind of ways that they illustrated this stuff, but it was all about calling the Israelites back to the covenant. And so if you want to understand the prophets well, strangely enough, the place you need to go is Deuteronomy 28 to 30. There's these 3 chapters of God kind of talking through, this is what happens if you obey me, this is what happens if you disobey me. And the prophets go through, and when they are predicting things, which is, as I said, it's not the point, but they're not actually saying, look, this is something novel, this is something that I've kind of dreamed up. They're actually saying, look, this is what God has promised would happen if you don't obey him, and this is what God has promised will happen if you do. So again, it's actually backwards focused rather than forwards. They're more talking about the consequences of what they're doing than necessarily coming up with something that is novel or new. So the prophets are far more kind of reflecting back the story of God than necessarily extending it in any way. They are calling people back to the covenant. And so as you look through the prophets, you'll see a lot of the time that either the heavens and the earth are called to witness, or the people are called to witness, or the courtroom sort of situations. It's actually reminding them that when they made the covenant, heaven and earth were witnesses. The people were witnesses against themselves. There was this kind of situation where basically it was this almost like a legal agreement that they made with God, and then God calls them back to it and says, hey, look, you're not living up to this. And if you're not living up to this, then these things are going to follow on. These things are going to happen. And you've been warned about this, but I'm reminding you again, because God is so patient and he's gracious and he's doing something about it. When the prophets do turn towards that forward look, it's often about not just reminding people of the covenant that they're operating under, but actually starting to talk to them about when God comes and says, look, this isn't working and it hasn't been working, so I'm going to bring a new covenant and a new way of dealing with. And so you start talking about what's known as the age to come, or the messianic age, or when Jesus shows up, basically. And so those things are really, really helpful. So the prophet's not so much about predicting the future as much as they are about reminding people of the covenant that they've been called to and the consequences of obedience and disobedience. If you can get your head around that, then you're going to enjoy the prophets a lot more. And again, approach them. They are quite kind of creative and artistic in the way that they do things. They'll use metaphors, they'll use illustrations and examples. They kind of pull in a whole bunch of stuff that we just need to wash over us and get the message of it. And so there's pictures of this. God planted a vineyard. or there was this great eagle that swooped down, or a tree grew here. They're all pictures of Israel or different nations that the prophet is talking about, and illustrating what is happening or is going to happen. The prophets are really good and really encouraging, and in the midst of them there can be some really, really challenging thoughts and some encouraging thoughts for us. So enjoy them. Remember that they are calling people back to a covenant, back to an agreement made between them and God, and helping them to understand what's going to happen depending on their choices. Thanks, team.